Let's get started. Today's lecture is going to be on the cervical vertebra, and we'll get to traditional, looks like it's moving and it is, motions, then we'll get to non-traditional, illusionary things. Okay. Cervical, top part. 7 cervical vertebra, and why do you go from cervical to thoracic? Because you start to have ribs attached. So these are everything above the rib articulating vertebra. Lumbar is everything below the rib articulating vertebra, and the rib articulated vertebra is thoracic. Okay, so these 7. Now, what you'll know, you should know this already. If not, no big deal. But as you work your way down, it makes sense that the floors on this skyscraper get denser and denser and denser because they have to hold up more stuff. This vertebra has to hold up less stuff than this one, has to hold up less stuff than this one. So as you work your way down, you're going to get denser and denser and denser, and you'll get less mobile, less mobile, less mobile. If you have to carry a heavy bucket of water, you're probably not going to swing it around or move as more as if it's light. Same thing here. These are your most movable vertebra because they don't have to support as much weight. They're allowed to move a lot more. So you're going to get a lot more motion. In addition, in the transverse plane, you have a specialty articulation up here. You guys might remember this from biology, the atlas axis. So atlas holds and it rotates about the axis, atlas axis, right? So that specific type of pivot joint allows you a big chunk of your overall rotation. Okay, so you're still going to get some summation from others, but it's a specialized joint that gets you more motion than if you wouldn't have it, because obviously our sight is very important for us, and we need to be able to kind of cover to be able to see from one shoulder all the way to the other shoulder. And it wasn't for that specialty vertebra, okay, you wouldn't get all the way across. However, it's still a sum total of all the little spins, even though this one's a little, this one's a little, this one's a little, and then finally when you get to the top there's a lot. There's still a summative effect in the transverse plane, okay? So one of the positives is that cervical motion follows the same rules as trunk motion. So you're going to have in the fetal, out of fetal, flexion, extension. You're going to have right and left lateral cervical bending instead of trunk bending, okay? When it looks like it's moving, and it is, a rule of thumb is right ear, right shoulder, left ear, left shoulder, right lateral, left lateral. And then we have the transverse. For the trunk, I told you to use the sternum as kind of a fixed point to reference. Here, we're going to use the nose, okay? Because I can move my eyes and not move my cervical vertebra, but I can't not move my nose. So look to the right, look to the left, right transverse, left transverse, right lateral, left lateral, flexion, extension, right transverse, left transverse. Deep breath. Remember from exam 1 the concept of left transverse from, right transverse to, right transverse from, left transverse to, okay, right lateral from, left lateral to, left lateral from, right lateral to, and you're like, from and to what? Then you need to go back and rewatch those first lectures. Anatomical position, of course. Okay, so again, cervical vertebra, a lot more motion than down here because they don't have as much responsibility holding up this noggin right here, especially mine. Not a lot to hold up there, so they have an easy job. My neck bones. So let's go to the super awesome Picasso da Vinci-like illustrations that I have up on the board for you guys, and hopefully this is meant to make life easy for you guys, where I literally give you what I just said. Right transverse to, right transverse from, left transverse to, left transverse from. So you see like the little exponential little thingies. So RTCR, right transverse cervical rotation to, start, finish. Then right transverse cervical rotation from, start, finish. Then left transverse cervical rotation to, left transverse cervical rotation from. Guys, this gives you all the scenarios for it looks like it's moving and it is. Because you could even start from anatomical and say, if I look to my right, right transverse cervical rotation from anatomical. Well, what if I start from anatomical and look to my left? Left transverse cervical rotation from. So you could even crisscross it, start in anatomical, and then say, what would that be? What would this be? Then you go lateral. You could start from anatomical and say, what's that? Right lateral cervical bending from. What about going back? Left lateral cervical bending to. What about going here? Left lateral cervical bending from. What about going back? Right lateral cervical. So this is all of the examples. Cervical extension, cervical flexion. Now, the one caveat, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't tell you guys, if I didn't practice what I preach. And I'm not going to assume you know what all this stuff is, okay? So that's one of the reasons why I make the nose so ridiculously big, is so that there's no confusion about where that sucker is. So if you're looking on the side, you can't miss it. Look at that big old beak. And if you're looking at the front, you can't miss it, man. Look at that big old triangle, right? So the sternum is represented by the straight line. That's so that you can reference where is your nose pointing relative to the sternum. Now, obviously, on a side view, notice how that line is in the front, because that's where your sternum would be if you're looking from the side. Right? That'd be your shoulder level, your sternum would be up here. So that line to your right is where the sternum would be, and then you could see deviation from it, okay? All right, so looks like it's moving, and it is. Cervical flexion, cervical extension. This is not hyperextension. That's just extension from anatomical. Hyper is when your neck goes back further than what it normally allows for. Excessive extension. Just like hyperflexion, like if you tackled with your head down, you may have hyperflexion, excessive motion that is beyond your normal range of motion, okay? So, cervical flexion, cervical extension, into fetal, out of fetal. Right lateral cervical bending, left lateral cervical bending, right lateral cervical bending, left lateral cervical bending. Right lateral from, left lateral to, left lateral from, right lateral to. Right transverse cervical rotation from, left transverse cervical rotation to, left transverse cervical rotation from, right transverse cervical rotation to. What if you did a full range of motion? Well, I got to be at the end of the interstate before I can travel cross country, right? So right transverse cervical rotation from, left transverse cervical rotation to anatomical, left transverse cervical rotation from anatomical. Right transverse cervical rotation to, right transverse cervical rotation from. Got it? Now, let's do illusions. Let's get to some illusions. Pardon me while I take a couple levels off of this platform, which is made entirely by books. We're on a budget. You got to make it work, all right? Got to make it work. Nothing wrong with making it work. All right. So here's the deal. We are going to take the same concept that we did from pelvis to trunk. Remember how I taught you this is the pubic symphysis, kind of the anterior middle of the pelvis, and this is your sternum, and you can look at right transverse trunk, left transverse pelvic, but right transverse trunk. We're going to do the same thing, except here I'm shifting it up. Pubis, sternum, sternum, nosum, sternum, nose. Right transverse cervical is the same as right transverse cervical. I'm looking at my right shoulder. When I go and I do right transverse cervical where it looks like it's moving, and it is, I go from literally lined up with my sternum to lined up with my right shoulder. The only way I could get there is if I have right transverse cervical rotation. If I move my whole body and I'm trying to make my sternum look to the left, regardless of if it's trunk motion or pelvic girdle motion, whether it's going along for the right, it doesn't matter. If my sternum wants to look over and see what's happening on the left side, but I want to keep my eyes fixed on you, If I don't move my neck, watch what's going to happen. So how do I spin my neck? How do I spin my cervical to stay looking at the screen? Right transverse cervical rotation. Hey, that's my right shoulder. Wow. And if I freeze it, freeze Rick, thanks Gru, I bring it back to anatomical. Sorry, let me try that again. My Gru impression needs work. Freeze Rick. How would I have to move to go back home? I'd have to spin my head to the left. Therefore, I spun my head to the right when I left home. Here to there is right transverse cervical rotation, because if your neck didn't move, if you had a halo, which people wear to, if they have neck injuries, or a neck brace where you couldn't spin if you tried, and your sternum went to look to the left, your head would go along for the ride. So to keep my eyes on that screen, I have to spin my cervical vertebra to the right. How you doing? Make sense? Okay. Left transverse cervical, right transverse cervical, left transverse cervical, right transverse cervical. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. It has to move in order to keep your functional circle of sight. Functional circle of sight usually happens two different ways. I need to stay looking at whatever danger, ball, problem, whatever. I need to stay focused on that, on my child, but I may need to reposition my body to do work, to prepare myself to run. So I need mechanisms in place to stay fixed on things. The other way functional circle of sight works is I may need to reposition my eyes to see behind my body. And so that's when you can get to right transverse pelvic, right transverse trunk, and right transverse cervical. I can see 180 degrees behind me in case I need to see what's coming behind me, or something startles me. Whoa, what was that? I need to have mechanisms in place to reposition my eyes to see behind my head. Okay? It looks like it's not moving, but it is. Transverse plane examples. Right transverse cervical, left transverse cervical. Okay? Dead horse. Come here. Sorry, guys, it's a metaphor, but I got to do it. All right, let's move on to frontal plane. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. A lot of what these illusions is you're basing cervical motion off of seeing the nose or the eye levels move. That's when it's moving, and it looks like it's moving, and it is. That's the easy ones. That's door moves about the wall. What I'm trying to teach you is how do we look for opening and closing of the door when the wall moves about the door, when the bigger piece moves about the smaller piece and the smaller piece doesn't go anywhere. So let's think of the Karate Kid made a comeback. They have the new Karate Kid on. And I remember as a kid watching the Karate Kid. I remember as a kid watching the Karate Kid. I use kid a lot. I remember as a kid watching Karate Kid with a kid. No, that doesn't work. Okay, here's the point. When Daniel LaRusso first bowed to Miyagi, Mr. Miyagi, and he's bowed and he did this, and Miyagi smacks him upside the head, and he said, "Bayow!" And he said, "No, no, look I, always look I." So Daniel adapted a new movement strategy. Instead of this, Daniel did this. And what I'm trying to show you is that this, in order to keep his eyes level, he had to extend the cervical vertebra. From home to this position, if I froze it and came back without moving my neck, I'm in an extended position. I have cervical extension, and coming back, cervical flexion. If you really went far back, like you went to do backwards, but you want to keep your eyes level, it's more cervical flexion. Freeze it, bring it back, look how I'm flexed. I'm more in the fetal here. So those are illusions in the sagittal plane. illusions in the frontal plane is if my body is trying to tilt my eyes across like this, try to process data with your eyes like this. It's not very easy. Try to walk across your room with your eyes at an angle. That's not how we're used to processing data. We want to keep our eyes level, and we have mechanisms in place to keep our eyes level. Just like waiters and waitresses, which, by the way, always tip your waiters and your waitresses. That's why they have mechanisms in place to keep the tray level, because someone may bump into them, they may be going upstairs. They have mechanisms in place to keep it level. You have the same thing. So if my body is trying to make my eyes unlevel because of athletics, because of exercise, because of something sudden, tripping, whatever, if your body is trying to make your eyes unlevel, your cervical vertebra will be there to recurve the other way to make sure they stay level. It's not just the trunk. Sometimes your trunk can contribute, but your cervical vertebra is the ultimate extra if you need it to make sure that your eyes stay level. So, looks like it's not moving, but it is. Left lateral cervical bending. My left ear is closer to my left shoulder. Just like if I do this. Left lateral cervical bending. Right lateral cervical. I look like one of those owls. You ever see the videos of the owls and they're like pooping owls? Owls doing all that stuff, man. That's as closest I can get to an owl. YouTube, it's pretty cool. Left lateral cervical bending. Right lateral cervical bending. Left lateral. Right lateral. Okay? Get a picture? In other words, if my neck didn't move, this is what would happen. Which brings me to the next one. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. So again, what I want you to do is, if you can't see this, is imagine that I'm in a neck brace. Imagine I'm in a halo. Imagine that I couldn't move my neck if I tried. You could see this. I could do that because I'm not moving my neck. So the illusion is, oh, look at nose. Nose is doing that. Nose is still lined up with sternum. This is not right lateral cervical bending. This is nothing. I mean, I may be bending my trunk, but you got to keep in mind, if the nose stays lined up and it doesn't deviate, let me show you deviation. Okay? So it looks like it's moving and it's not. Someone may think that Daniel LaRusso is flexing his cervical vertebra and then extending his cervical vertebra. You guys need to say, well, maybe he is, maybe he's not. Let me look at the clues that I learned in my undergraduate anatomical kinesiology class to see if there's definitive flexion or extension. And if he does this and everything stays in line and you don't see, then there was no flexion. There is no extension. There may be flexion and extension of your hips, and everything on top may be going along for the ride, but we do not assume. Let's look at illusions of it looks like it's moving, but it's not in the transverse plane. Remember, I have a halo. I have a neck brace. I couldn't move my neck if I tried. Hey, look to my right. I can't. Look to my right. Look to my left. So your body is always going to have these contingency plans. What if my neck is hurt and I can't look to my right? Well, I could always rotate on my hips and rotate my pelvic girdle, and everything else above it is going to go along for the ride. Basically, it's like saying, hey, eyes, I hear you can't move on your own. I'm going to look to the right and take you along for the ride so that you can see what's over there. So this is nothing, and this is nothing at my cervical vertebra. It looks like it is, but it's not. It looks like it is, but it's not. It looks like it is, but it's not. But it's not. Get it? My boys love that joke. So, rewind this first part if you must, because now I'm about to get into the super crazies. We're about to put all the pieces together: pelvis, sternum, and cervical. And I'm going to do some different deviations, and we're going to try to analyze. We're going to look at the clues, and we're going to try to figure out what's moving. All right. Speaking of what's moving, my computer is moving. All right. So let's see. I think after this, I'm going to listen to a little George Strait. All right, guys. Let's see if I can give you a visual of this. Okay. Pubis. Here's my left anterior superior iliac spine, my right superior and inferior iliac spine, right and left ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine, on my left anterior superior iliac spine, and my right, my pubis is in the middle. So in other words, if you can see my left and my right hips, pubis is in the middle. Here's my sternum. If you can see my right shoulder and my left shoulder, sternum's in the middle. Here's my nose. If you can see my right ear and my left ear, nose is in the middle. Pelvis, sternum, nose. That reminds me of that song, head, shoulder, knees and toes, knees and toes. Heads, pubis, sternum, nose, sternum, nose. I just made that up. Don't delete me. Here we go. Left transverse, right transverse. Right transverse, left transverse. Right transverse, left transverse. Now, where things can get crazy is, you need to ask yourself, was there motion at the pelvis, was there motion at the trunk, and or was there motion at the cervical? There's 3 layers to this game, okay? Layers! Ogres have layers! This is going to be tough. It's going to be tough. Let me get a book. This book is going to help me represent the pelvis. Let's see if I have a sharp. Ogres have layers. All right. So this book is going to help me see if the pelvis does any of this kind of stuff. All right. All right. Okay. Here we go. What if I do this? Start, finish. Start, finish. Here's the question. Did the pelvic girdle rotate? If yes, how? Did the trunk rotate? If yes, how? Did the cervical rotate? If yes, how? Let's look at it again. Start, finish. Pubis, sternum, lined up. Nose, lined up. Everybody's lined up. So you ask yourself, who's still lined up? Pelvis, sternum, still lined up. Nose, not lined up. So that tells me that the trunk went along for the ride. The trunk went along for the ride with the pelvis. I had left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, but I did not have trunk motion. I did have cervical motion because my nose did not go along for the ride. If I would have done this, the only thing I'd have had would have been left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip internal rotation, right hip external rotation. But because you saw my nose, pubis, sternum, nose, right transverse cervical rotation. Okay? All right, how about this one? There's no way I could do this with the book. I'm going to start out here. Nose, sternum. is anatomical. Pelvis, sternum, nose. With me? You observe this. Pelvis, sternum, nose. One more time. I start here. Pelvis, sternum, nose. And you observe this motion. Pelvis, sternum, nose. What moved? And what didn't move? Did the pelvis move? Yes or no? Did the trunk move? Yes or no? Did the cervical vertebra move? Yes or no? If yes, how? If no, move on. Press pause. Think about it. Do it. Welcome back. It's important to establish position. My trunk is twisted to my right. My sternum is looking at my right hip. My cervical vertebra is twisted to my left. My nose is looking at my left shoulder. It's important to establish starting positions. And then I observe this motion. The pelvis stayed looking at you. The pelvis didn't spin. I had no pelvic girdle rotation. My sternum went from looking to my right hip to looking to my left hip. I had left transverse trunk rotation. My nose went from looking at my left shoulder to looking at my right shoulder. The only way that can happen is if I have right transverse cervical rotation. Yeah? You getting the hang of this? All right, how about this one? How about this one? Ready? Pelvis, sternum, nose. Pelvis, sternum, nose. Shake the edges again. Start all over. Pelvis, sternum, nose. Pelvis, sternum, nose. What moved? What didn't move? Did the pelvis rotate? Yes or no? If yes, how? If no, move on. Did the trunk rotate? If yes, how? If no, move on. Did the cervical vertebra rotate? If yes, how? If no, move on. It's always important to start off with where are you positioned. Do you see why it's important to know where are you at? Someone calls you and says, I need directions. I need directions. I'm trying to find you. The first thing you're going to do before you give them directions of motion is say, where are you at? Where is my joints at? My trunk is twisted to its left. My cervical isn't twisted at all. These are lined up. My cervical is anatomical. My trunk's twisted to my left. My trunk goes from being twisted to the left to going home, anatomical position. My trunk had right transverse trunk rotation. My cervical was an anatomical at the start, and it's still an anatomical to the finish. My cervical vertebra did not move. Although it may seem like it spun to the right, it did not. My trunk did all of that. My neck went along for the ride. Right? How about this one? Too hard. Ready? Start. Finish. Start. Finish. Start. Finish. Pubis, sternum, nose. left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip internal, right hip external. Right transverse trunk, nothing up here. I didn't need to. I didn't need to. All right? Okay. What about this? See the difference? Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip abduction. Trunk is pretty much staying home, nothing obvious. Right lateral trunk bending is going to bring me further down to the ground. Left lateral trunk bending is going to recurve me. What if I'm going so far down that my trunk isn't enough? Then I can bend my head back to make sure my eyes stay level. That neck is like extra insurance to reposition your trunk. Okay? Okay, what about this? Start here. Nose, sternum, pelvis. And you observe this. Nose, sternum, pelvis. I'll do it again. Start. Nose, sternum, pelvis. Nose, sternum, pelvis. That was left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of fluctuations of hip motion. I had left internal, then right external, then left internal, then right external because I was hobbling back and forth so that I could get complete range of motion across. But the point is that my pelvis was spinning to its left, but my trunk was going along for the ride. The sternum and the pelvis stayed lined up the whole time. So I did not have any trunk rotation, but I did have cervical rotation. Here's my sternum, there's my nose. I am twisted to my left in the transverse plane. Going home, right transverse cervical rotation to, right transverse cervical rotation from. Hot dog. Isn't this fun? Isn't this fun? So, keep in mind, right and left, this is just a review, y'all have had this before, but right and left mean two different things in two different dimensions. Of course, right arm, left arm. But when you're talking about having one of something, right and left literally means to the right or to the left. Like doing a cartwheel, to your right or to your left. Spinning, to your right, to your left. And then you're like, well, Dr. Campbell, what about the right arm? Doesn't it have a right and left? Absolutely. But because they're mirrors of each other, you can't say the right of the right, because the right of the right is a different part of the arm of the right of the left. The right of the right is on the outside. The right of the left is on the inside. So what do? We create mirror terms like lateral and medial. That's why we do that. The double doors spin two different ways globally, but the same way locally. Close, open. Cervical, trunk, pelvis, there's only one of them. So right and left literally means to the right, to the left in the frontal, or to the right, to the left in the transverse. If you ask a child to spin to their right or spin to the left, they're transversing. If you ask them to do a cartwheel to the right, to the left, or think about it, shuffle to your right, to your left. literally to the right, to the left. Okay? So, if you have any questions, clarifications, that's why I'm here. It is important to stay up with the information. Very important. And to ask if you need help with clarifications. Okay? The kind of help I'm talking about isn't, I'm doing real bad, I need help in terms of points. It's not the kind of help I can offer. I can help clarify things. And you know what else can help clarify things is just rewatching the lecture, taking notes, pausing and answering. When you're going through your test, answer every question is fill in the blank. Every question I ask can be answered without looking at the answer choices. See which answer choice confirms what you already know. It's another way to look at it. Because if you don't really know it, all of those answer choices are going to confuse you. But that's only because you don't really know it. My job is to get you on that level where you have confidence and you know this stuff. And like I said, I get it. You know, so many classes, you're like, when am I ever going to use this stuff? When am I ever going to use this stuff? I spent all this time to learn it. When am I ever going to use this stuff? You're going to use this stuff. You're going to use this stuff. The only way you're not going to use this stuff is if you decide to go do something outside of kinesiology. And in that example, why are you in kinesiology? My point is that if you stay in kinesiology, you're going to use this stuff forever. Being able to see where kids are positioned, being able to see change in position, being able to see body position, being able to understand that, well, if the trunk, even though I don't teach you this because this is just an undergraduate human movement class, the pieces, you're going to start to build on your tree of knowledge. You're going to say, wow, so that's what scoliosis is? That you have some vertebra that kind of unnaturally start to bend to the right, and so the upper parts start to try to recurve to keep your trunk level, and that's why you have this crazy lateral curve, because you don't want to keep doing this. So as this does this, the top part starts to recurve back. Yeah. Yeah. It's not too late, but it's getting to be too late if we don't stay up on the information and the knowledge, okay? Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. I know sometimes things happen, but don't get into the habit of waiting and saying, oh, I can watch that tomorrow. I'll watch it the next day, because then all of a sudden the new knowledge starts to muddy the old knowledge. Watching a video of my lectures just introduces you to maybe some new concepts. To truly develop them and master them, you either have to watch and rewatch or participate. You watch it the first time and you just absorb it. Then maybe you watch it again and you reenact it. You put yourself in my shoes and you, okay, oh yeah, I see how here to there that would be. And then maybe to develop mastery, you start applying your newfound knowledge to other people or other, you're watching television, you're watching games, you're watching baseball, you're watching football. It doesn't matter. You're watching equestrian. It doesn't matter. Horse turns, but you want to stay looking over there. It doesn't matter. That's what's super great about human movement, is that you don't have to be an expert in ice hockey. You don't have to be an expert in golf. You don't have to be an expert in all this stuff, because the human body doesn't care about your expertise. The wrist only does wrist things, and the cervical only does cervical things, and the hip only does hip things. And just like I emphasized, knowing anatomical is so important, because then you could see things that are not anatomical. Understanding normal limits of range of motion, understanding what the norm is, can help you see what is not normal. And that just comes with practice. Best way to learn a foreign language? Find someone to talk it. You'll learn it real quick. Okay? So we have to see these things, practice these things, develop these things, master these things, because then life's going to get super fun. Because then once you learn how to play the game of kinesiology cards, you'll start playing and having fun playing, and every hand is different. Every patient you have is going to be different. Every client you have is going to be different. Every athlete you're going to have is different. Every at-home health patient you're going to have different. Every mama is different. Every papa is different. But that doesn't mean the game is different. You have 52 cards in the deck. You have wrists and elbows and shoulders. It just means there's a lot of different variables where every hand is slightly different. And you need to know how to play the cards. And that comes with practice, okay? So keep it up. Positive, encouraging. I'm K-Love Campbell, call me. I'm trying to be positive and encouraging, but I need you guys to help me out. I need you guys to really invest in rewatching these videos, asking for help to clarify things, and staying up on the information, okay? Y'all have a great day.